homes, like saying, now what?
Mm.
So
Do you think so? When I was like learning about burning single family home, no one, I mean, not, I mean, people did talk about like you have to put some reserve for uh like vacancy and repair, right? So like I did that, but when my tenant stopped paying and we had to go through eviction, like I mean that just blew up that savings too, right? Because
yeah.
the saving is not that much. But so I'm curious if multifamily doesn't have that problem. I mean, it will with like if say like something like tree falls onto the building, like obviously you have to pay a lot more money. But yeah, like can you actually make money with like stable money with owning apartment complexes?
Yeah, like, or right now, I 50 out of 50 or 50 out of 51 of my units are rented out, right? So literally, if I evict the tenant and they stop paying me, it's just $500, right? But then I have between my apartments around $28,000 in gross rents, like just gross, right? So if a tenant doesn't pay, I have more of a cushion, right? Like I said, I'm cash flowing about $8,000 to $10,000 a month, depending on my expense that month. So even then, I have $8,000 of cushion. So if literally, yeah, if like I have 5 tenants that don't pay me, it's okay. I still got like 46 others paying me. But even on top of that, like this is where I got burned too. Like you still need a reserve. Like for me, I
Mm,
don't know why I chose this number. So like what I was taught was basically 5% of your gross rents on a monthly basis is your reserve, right? So if you do like let's say I'm $30,000, so 10% would be around 3,000. So about 5% would be $1,500 a month as reserve. Honestly, like for me, because I'm not actually living off my positive income, right? So it's kind of different for me. Like the money just stays in the account. I don't really see it, and I live off of my
mm,
W-2 income, so that's a luxury I have. But I will say there's more of a cushion. But honestly, for me, I'm trying to build up at least $150,000 of reserve just for all
mm.
my properties. Why $150,000? I have no idea. It's just my comfort number. Where if a roof broke and it cost me $40,000 to replace that roof, I'm not stressed.
Yeah,
But okay, let's just say like you only had like $30,000 in reserve and you get to replace a $40,000 roof, you'd be stressed, right?
yeah,
If you had 150, okay, 40 sucks, but I still have 110 left. So for me, it's my reserve. So that's why I dipped into the point why I got so stressed because I dipped into beyond my reserves. And I was dipping into my lines of credit. Like I have a stock
that's
portfolio.
scary.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have like I had like a $200,000 reserve plus $300,000 in lines of credit that I can access. And I literally
yeah.
blew through my $200,000 reserve, and I blew through half of my line of credit.
And the line of credit rate changes.
Yes, and the rates went up on me, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
super
had
like stressful every time Fed have a meeting, right?
yeah, like I have a nice stock portfolio, right? I bought a bunch of Apple stocks like way back. Um, but like I do the asset line of credit and Charles Schwab, and dude, my interest rate went from like 2 all the way up to like 8.
Yeah,
This past year, I have a First Republic bank, the bank that went bankrupt and got bought by Chase. I have a
yeah.
$100,000 line of credit through them, but the interest rate's only 2.5%. I was like, oh, okay, that one's good, and it didn't raise; it just stayed at two and a
Mm.
half. But once that loan expires in 3 years, they're not going to renew it because it's
Yeah,
losing
they're
money.
losing money.
But
Yeah.
I would say like this is just my approach. Like I'm in real estate for the long term, and I'm trying to be like more lifestyle oriented and not as stressful. So for me, I want 100,000, 150 at least, and
Mm.
then plus still have my lines of credits. But hopefully not have to use a line of credit, or if I do use a line of credit, it's only for like temporary renovations.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of my approach because I've been through and experienced blowing through all that, right? So that's why I say it's like super discouraging. Like, and that's why I'm not buying right now. Interest rates are terrible, number one. And number two, I'm actually trying to build up my reserves again because I
Mhm,
dipped
mhm.
so low, like uncomfortably low. I was very
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And I didn't know if I was going to sell my mobile home park, to be honest. Like the guy almost backed out the
Mhm.
last minute, but he found a new partner and they ended up closing the deal within the span of like 5 days. So it was just like a huge roller coaster. But
Yeah.
I had to keep that mobile home park, which was negative $10,000 a month. Like, dude, you're bleeding $10,000 a month, right?
Yeah.
So I went from like negative $13,000 a month all the way to making like $10,000 a month. So that was like a $23,000 swing for me, which is like,
Wow.
I'm still trying to process everything, right? I'm just used to like bleeding money every month. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's just kind of my approach. Cause like you said, I want to be very conservative, and I want to, there's something called the unknown, like things you don't, the unknowns that you're not aware of, the unaware
Yeah.
unknowns. Sorry, that's the phrase,
Yeah.
the unaware unknowns. And even me, right? Like I'm more experienced than like, let's say you, but there's stuff that I'm unaware of that's unknown for me. And there's just something about owning apartments for a longer period of time. You just get more experience doing it,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
then even me, I'm relatively new, even though I went full cycle, but I went basically full cycle on 3 commercial assets, right? Um, but it's different now because now I'm old. I renovated everything, and now I'm just sitting back and saying, okay, like what repairs do I need to make? Because I have this old apartment complex, 1970s, right, C-class apartment. So now I'm trying to sit back and see, okay, like what issues, what repairs are there? Because if there's a hailstorm in Oklahoma, it's going to devastate my roof, and it's going to cost me $30,000 to replace that roof because insurance doesn't cover it, right?
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
right out the gate, okay, do I have enough to replace 2 roofs for my 26 unit and my 20 unit? That's 60K
Mm.
at least, right? So the bigger your portfolio becomes, the more reserve you need,
Yeah.
right? So, they teach, like, I think Dave Ramsey teaches you need 3 to 6 months of expenses. So
Mm.
my expense is very high, right? If you add up my monthly expenses, it's a lot of money. So times that by 6, and that's my comfort level, right? So, but I get it. In the beginning, the first deal, you kind of get to leverage a little more and not have as much reserve. But once you get that first deal stabilized and you do well on it, then you can start building up your reserve. Because like I said, like you want to stay in the game long term, right? Like
Hmm.
you lose real estate when you sell, and then you run out of reserves. But if you have
Mm.
reserves, you're able to pivot and make other decisions. So
Yeah.
so to answer your question, there's more cushion in multifamily, but I still think you need good reserves. I think way more than that 5% that people recommend. Like if you're owning it yourself, because what syndicators want to do is they do a 5% reserve because they want to give distributions
Mm.
to their investors to look good.
Hmm.
A lot of syndicators, they'll raise money for another deal and then use that money to give distributions for the other apartment complex that's failing. That's a pyramid scheme, right? That's a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
So that's the tricky part with multifamily. So like I said, that's kind of my approach. Like I'd rather just get a little deal. And like by all means, like if I'm worth like 50 to 100 million, then maybe I'll invest in this indicator because at that point I'm just so rich that if they lose my money, whatever, it doesn't affect my lifestyle. But right now, if I lose 50 to 100K, well, I did lose 50 to 100K, but if I lose another 50 to 100K, then it'll be stressful, right? Um,
Yeah.
so I just say it depends on your season of life and where you're at in wealth. But I think because we're in wealth building phase, I think it just makes more sense to like do it yourself, and then
Mm.
eventually, like you can invest in things. Like I see like Brandon Turner, from Bigger Pockets. If you listen, like he's like, I remember hearing him on a podcast saying, "Oh, I never lost money." And I was just like, "No way, you must be
Really? Is
fat."
that that?
He said that he never lost on a deal, and I was
I'll
just like,
be
"Well,
now I know that if someone like the operator has lost money, like I wouldn't want to invest with them. Because that means like they didn't I feel like they didn't make mistake and learn.
yeah,
And then I think one of the investors I talked to said the same thing. Um just run away as far if they said they never made mistakes or they never failed or
yeah."
like they never lost money. Yeah.
That's why I'm surprised because like I'm like, dude, like this guy, like you just put your reputation on the line. Like he's a
Yeah.
pretty big real estate figure. And I mean, he's been investing. I mean, if you started investing in like 2010 all the way up to 2022, like
Mm.
you've never lost. And that's if you listen to all the investors, the syndicators, they all started in this time, myself included. I started in a good time, like in retrospect, right? So like it's rosy. They haven't experienced the bad time, but I know because I own 90 units, and I know like no way. Like there's always one deal where you lost money on the deal, But overall, yes, you're gonna be positive and be good, but like there's no way you didn't lose money on a deal.
Yeah.
After this many deals, right? Like that is already fabrication already. So
Mhm.
that's why I said, because I'm in the weeds, because I'm an operator, I know when people are kind of like trying to bullshit me a little bit. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, well, you say that, but like that's why I stopped kind of listening to that podcast, because I'm like, they're just fabricating things a little too much, and it's a little bit
Mhm.
unrealistic. Like, oh, I bought 2 properties and retired. I'm like, well, if you work at Starbucks, yeah, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. If you work at Starbucks, yeah. But if you're like a professional, high income W-2, no, it's not gonna be that
Yeah.
fast. So you really have to know the context behind it, and then that's what kind of inspired me to just share. Is I'm just like, my God, like, I'm not good at marketing myself, but like what I say is like just the truth and what my
Mhm.
experience. I'm not. I
Yeah.
don't. I'll tell you the good, the bad, the ugly, the truth, whatever it is. I tell
I
you
yeah,
what I'm.
I
Yeah.
really like that honesty and transparency, because
Yeah.
I think all these gurus from social media, I'm sure a lot of them fabricate the numbers too. But just like, oh, like I bought this, and I was able to retire in less than a year. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know how that, yeah, I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, they retire because they sell courses, right? And
Yeah.
I'm in that course mentorship business too. But then, like the different, so it's funny. Like people, they like have nice cars and they flex this thing, but like they make most of their wealth and their net worth is from selling a course.
Mm.
Versus like for me, I don't have to sell a single course. I don't have to sell a single YouTube video or anything, and I'm already worth 5 million, right? So I've already built it, and then I'm going to teach. So
Yeah.
like that's what I mean by you have to like really pay attention to who you listen to, right? And take things
Hmm.
with a grain of salt. Because a lot of like even personal finance YouTubers, they'll tell you how to do this, but they haven't done it themselves.
Mm.
For me, I'm just
Yeah.
telling you what I'm doing. Like I
Yeah.
literally don't need a plan. I just tell you what I'm doing, right? Like literally, I don't need to like prepare for anything. I just talk about what I did yesterday or what I
Yeah.
did today, right? So like I
Yeah.
don't need to like plan. I just talk. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the nuanced part. But because I'm poor at marketing, yeah, like my audience is a little smaller. But I think long term, the best, the good, the actual people will rise up, right? And then
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
gurus
I agree.
will make their quick money, but they will quickly like flame out,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Uh, I know we're at like
Oh,
8
you're
p.m., but
good. You're
I have
good.
a
You're good.
few more questions
Yeah, I have
that I
till
wanted
nine.
to cover.
I have till nine.
Okay. Okay. I wanted to ask you about like how do you calculate expenses? Because I saw your one of the videos and then you're just like 50%. Is that like how you usually go about it, or do you try to go line by line? But look, where do you even get that numbers, right?
Yeah, honestly, I when I underwrite a deal that I'm buying, so yeah, I have a bunch of videos out right now about underwriting, but I just quick back of napkin math is 50%, right? So what I do is when you send a letter out to an owner, they call you, and then the first thing you usually ask for is like, can I get your T12, which is the profit and loss statement, and a rent roll, right? And then on the T12, what I'm looking for is what's the expense relative to the income, right? And more times than not, the expense ratio could be fabricated, right? It's usually
Mm,
about 30 to like 40%. But given that I've operated 2 apartment complexes already, given their C class, my apartments are at 55% um, expense ratio. So it's a little bit higher than 50. But like I said, they're now stabilized. So now I'm kind of monitoring my expense ratio right now because I literally renovated most of the units. And right now I'm just sitting back collecting that cash flow. So my expense ratio should be a little bit less, right? So I'm trying to see what that expense ratio is. But, I think for quick back and napkin math, 50% is usually a good rule of thumb. A lot of the brokers and syndicators, if they share like 30% expense ratios, like that's pretty fabricated because
yeah.
if you're A-class apartment, yes, there's less capex, but you have more amenities, right? You have a pool, you have a gym, you have a dog park, you have more maintenance people, right? So I think as a general rule of thumb, 50% is usually my rule of thumb, like for expenses. So if you make $10,000, and that's before your debt too. right? So if your gross rent is 2,000, like my 20 unit, for example, I get about $9,000 gross right now. It's pretty safe to say that my expense is 4,500, and then my loan is about 2,600, right?
Do
So
you do you stop at 50% when you underwrite the deal, or do you also go in and try to get the exact number to see if it's more than 50%, right? It could be like 60%, right?
yeah, so from the T12, if it's higher than 50%, then I use the higher number, right? So the minimum expense ratio is 50%. But if their P&L is showing 60% consistently, then I'm gonna go with 60% because you want to be conservative, right? In terms of
Yeah.
your, unless there's like a huge one-time expense. But if there's a big huge one-time expense in one unit, you can kind of foreshadow that there's gonna be a huge one-time expense in your other 19 units, right? Like I just had an HVAC system bust in my 20 unit, cost me like $3,000 to replace it, and I know in the back of my mind next summer there's probably gonna be a couple more that break, right, when it gets hot
Mm.
and people turn on the HVAC. So for me, I kind of take that as actual income for myself, but the lenders, when they underwrite, they will remove these big one-time expenses. Like, oh, there's a huge plumbing issue here, remove it. There's a HVAC issue here, remove it. But for me, if it happened already, it's probably going to happen again, right?
Yeah.
So I always take, because I want to be conservative for myself. I'm not trying to appease investors, right? Like I'm just trying to be realistic for my own numbers. So minimum 50%, but it could be more depending on your deal.
But but if the T12 says 40%, how can I make sure uh and say, yeah, the T12 says 40%, but actuality it could be 60, 65, right?
Yeah.
But if I'm underwriting 50%, I'm not being conservative. So how would you go about like finding those numbers? Or
Yeah.
is it worth finding those numbers?
Honestly, like when you get a P&L, you can people can fabricate those numbers, right? Like
Yeah.
they could literally give you a P&L from my 26 unit and just say, hey, like these are the numbers, but people can make up whatever, right? Like my owner for my 26 unit, he didn't have a P&L. He just told me his annual tax. He just wrote down like three numbers. One was the gross rent, and two was the um, total expense, and three was just his property tax for that year, right? So like even with 50%, just know that you need to have cushion um, in case for those things, right? Like for example, when I wrote my 26 unit, I had a 10% cash and cash return day one, right? That's how I underwrote the deal. But reality was when I took over the apartment complex, I had 5 tenants leave. So my 10% cash and cash return became break even, slightly negative. So you kind of, when you underwrite it, it's all estimations at the end of the day. But if you do want to get more accurate, like property tax numbers, you just can Google. So my mentorship does teach all that. So I have videos on all this. But basically, property tax is transparent, right? You can Google Oklahoma, Santa Clara County property tax rate, right? And it'll
Yeah.
tell you what the percentage is, right?
I think
Insurance, you can
yeah,
just
taxes is insurance too.
insurance, you can get a quote, right? In terms of like water utilities, typically you're gonna have water, trash, a little bit harder to estimate. Usually that's accurate on the P&L, right? You can look at the P&L and see what the water bill is. It's usually pretty consistent, right? Like my 20 unit, when I bought it, it was hovering around like 700 to $1,000. And fast forward to today, I'm a little bit about 1,200 because I have all 20 units occupied, right? When they had it, it was 15. So like trash is usually consistent. The water is consistent. If you have common area electricity, like the laundry room, you have a fitness room, whatever, that's pretty consistent. So that's how you can get a more accurate picture of expenses if you want to dive in deeper. But honestly, I've never really dived in that deep. I just kind of did like 50%. And it hasn't burned me so far. I did get burned in my mobile home park. I they gave me a P&L, and basically the park was making $8,000 and the expense was $8,000. But fast forward to like 2 years later, I'm making $8,000 and my expense is like 18,000. So,
Yeah.
when you have a lot of land, right? If you have a lot of acreage land, grass, trees, the expense goes up, right? So you can start to get it. Like for the apartments, they're small, so it's pretty easy to estimate. Like you said, like the landscaping bill should be pretty consistent. The pest control bill is consistent. Water, common area utilities is consistent. The property tax insurance, you can figure that out. Property management, their fees, right? So pretty much like those 7, you pretty much know all of it, right? And then you can factor in for some repairs and maintenance issues. That's the only thing that's kind of variable if things break down. So
Yeah.
pretty, because like if you think about, I'm still underwriting my deal at 50%, even though I fixed everything. So in the beginning, 50% probably underestimates it a little bit, but fast forward to stabilization where I'm at, 50% is probably aggressive, right? It's probably actually going to be less than 50%.
Yeah.
So I'm just waiting for my P&L for this month. This is the first month where I'm like positive cash flow, right? Or like, fully rented out. So I'll see. I'm getting about 18K in rent, but I'm curious to see what my expense is. So,
Yeah.
So I'm going to wait for the next 6 months to see like what my average is, and maybe it'll be a little bit less than 50. But I think 50 overall as an average for the first couple of years is pretty a good bet, I'd say. But just know that in the beginning, it's probably gonna be more because you're renovating stuff.
Yeah.
You're pumping in money. So I don't get too caught up in that. Like the problem of us analytical people, I'm projecting you're in tech and you like Excel sheets, right? Like don't get it's more of an art than a science, right? So like you're just running these numbers to see what offer makes sense and what the new value will be. But that's still a guesstimation at the end of the day, right? Like for me, I bought my 26 unit for $500,000. It appraised at 750K day one. So I made $250,000 in instant equity, and I doubled my rents, which doubled the value of my apartment complex. So now it's worth 1.5 million at least, right? So I made $800,000 over 2 years. If I missed my expense by like 5%, does it matter? I made $800,000 in equity, right? And now I'm cash flowing 10K a month. It can make up for that. So you have to like underwrite that way, but then just see big picture too, right? Like my 20 unit, I'm not sure the video is out, but I had to spray all 20 units because I had a bed bug outbreak because it was letting homeless people in.
Yeah, I read the newsletter.
Oh yeah.
It's really traumatizing.
Yeah, and like we even said, I had to fumigate 1 unit because the bed bugs came back. Yeah, I just was praying like, please don't infest all their units, but it's a recurring issue, right? So like, yeah, each time I fumigate a unit, it's like $500. And guess how much rent I'm collecting? I'm collecting $500. So if I had to fumigate 1 unit, I just lost 1 unit's worth of rent. But that's why you have 20 units to help cover for these things. So like you said, it's a long-term game. But next year, when I raise rents by $25 per unit times 50 units, that's like $1,300. So it's the long game, right? Like you just have to like view it long term. So that's why I like working my W-2. And then it's just kind of like balancing that game. So I know, like you said, I know a lot of people start off buying real estate and then they become big on like mentorship courses and they just do that because it's more the real estate is like, honestly, if you have the mentality of the real estate just self-sustains itself, then I make income somewhere else to then buy more real estate. That's how you build a massive amount of wealth. Right. But if you just are trying to like, build wealth, like not like crazy amounts, but like just enough to replace your W-2, then, you could just like do your regular job and do that. Cause our jobs hit a ceiling, right? Like I kind of been making the same amount of money since like 2015, but everything's way more expensive and interest rates are high now too. So yeah, it's just really not falling too much into the weeds. Like I honestly, whenever you join the mentorship, I give you my underwriting calculator, and it just breaks. It's a quick back of the napkin math. Just underwrite the deal, and then you can ask the lenders too, like, hey, like what expense ratio do you assume for this part? And they'll tell you, right? So you can use 50%. Usually it's around 50%. Most lenders I talk to, I ask them like, hey, like tell me like what expense ratio do you underwrite? They'll tell you like, oh yeah, we use like 50% too. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm just using what the lender is using, right? And the lender
Yeah,
has 8% of the
pretty
money in the deal.
conservative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you know the lenders are conservative too because they have more money in the deal than you,
Mhm.
right? So that's how I underwrite it. But I just would caution, just don't get too into it. You know, like just
Mm.
underwrite it. I just want to make sure that if a broker gives you 30%, that you know it's
Oh
bullshit.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
You go
Yeah,
up to
that's a
50%,
push it. I
right?
think I'm like I have a tendency to be like more exact. Like I want to know exactly how much that's gonna cost. But I guess that's a good point where like I can't ever do that, and it's more of a guesstimation.
Yeah, like you'll never like people. My contractor told me like, oh, it's gonna be 30,000 to fix this burned out unit, my 20 unit. It cost me 45. So, right? So I mean, at the end of the day, like you can guesstimate it, but when the bill comes, are you able to hit that, take that bill, right? That's why like,
Yeah.
that I call it the stupid tax cushion. If there's things that I'm gonna be unaware of, I need to be prepared for it. So I need a bunch of money just there to take care of things that I'm unaware of.
Mm.
So because there'll always be things that you're unaware of. Like
Yeah.
despite doing all the due diligence, despite doing everything, you're gonna have a surprise always, guaranteed.
Mhm.